The week I turned 18, my parents packed up a moving truck and left the state without me. They didn't sit me down, they didn't explain anything. They left a single note on the kitchen counter that said, "You're strong enough to manage." No address, no money, no plan. Years later, I sent one quiet message to my father, "Check the filing." Within minutes, he sent 3 frantic texts back to back. "What did you do?" And then nothing, just silence. My name is Sabrina Keller. I'm 32. A week after they left, the landlord knocked on the door. I remember the sound, 3 firm taps, not angry, not gentle, just procedural. I thought maybe it was about the trash bins or the lawn. I opened the door barefoot, still wearing the same oversized sweatshirt I'd been sleeping in since the house felt too quiet to rest properly. He didn't step inside. He told me the lease had been terminated. That paperwork had already been filed, that my parents had handled it before they moved. His tone wasn't cruel, it was careful, like he was explaining weather. I stood there holding the edge of the door and waiting for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't one. I had 6 days to clear out. 6 days. At first my body didn't react. My brain tried to make it administrative. Okay, 6 days, that's almost a week. That's manageable. I nodded like I understood what manageable meant. Then I closed the door and my hands started shaking so hard I had to sit on the kitchen floor. The note was still on the counter. I could see it from where I was sitting. "You're strong enough to manage." My pulse went strange, slow, and heavy. Not racing, just heavy, like my body had realized something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I didn't have savings. I'd been handing most of my grocery store paycheck over for household bills before they left. I didn't have relatives nearby. No forwarding address meant no forwarding help. The refrigerator had half a gallon of milk and some wilted lettuce. I remember staring at it like it might offer advice. The next few days blurred into cardboard boxes and trash bags. I sold what little furniture was technically mine for cash, cheap desk, mattress, a lamp. I told coworkers I was between places, like that was a trendy lifestyle choice instead of eviction by proxy. For a few nights, I slept on a coworker's couch. She was kind, but I could feel the strain by the 3rd evening, the careful politeness, the way she avoided eye contact when I asked if I could stay one more night. I don't blame her. We were 18. Nobody signs up to inherit someone else's crisis. After that, I folded the back seats down in my aging Honda and learned how to sleep without fully stretching my legs. I parked behind a 24-hour supermarket because the lights stayed on and there were always a few cars around. Safety, invisibility. I kept my shoes on when I slept. Mornings were the hardest. The stiffness, the fog on the windows, the small panic of checking if anyone had noticed me. I'd drive to a budget gym I couldn't really afford anymore and shower quickly, counting the minutes in my head so no one would question how long I'd been there. I kept my clothes in the trunk, folded tight to avoid wrinkles. Presentation mattered. If I looked stable, maybe I would feel stable. I lived off instant oatmeal packets made with hot water from the gas station and clearance bread from the supermarket bakery rack. I calculated every dollar in my head before spending it. Gas or food, laundry or phone bill. The stakes weren't abstract anymore. They were physical. If I didn't find something steady soon, I wouldn't just be embarrassed. I'd be exposed, visible. And once you're visible in that way, people start making decisions about you that you don't get to control. By the end of that first week alone, I understood something very clearly. No one was coming back for me. I stopped waiting for something to rescue me and started applying everywhere. Clinics, warehouses, retail stores, hotels. I didn't filter for pride or preference. I filtered for open now and hiring immediately. I'd sit in my car in the supermarket parking lot with my phone plugged into a portable charger and send out application after application until my eyes blurred. The overnight hotel job came through first. It was a roadside place, nothing fancy, the kind travelers use when they're too tired to keep driving. The general manager told me the shift would be midnight to 8 in the morning. It paid hourly. At first in cash. I remember nodding like that detail didn't matter, even though it mattered a lot. Cash meant no waiting period, no payroll delay. It meant gas in the tank before it ran out. The lobby smelled faintly like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The lights were always slightly too bright at night, humming overhead. My job was mostly checking in late arrivals, answering the phone, and staying awake. There were long stretches where nothing happened at all. During those stretches, the general manager let me sit in the tiny staff office behind the desk. Sometimes, if it was truly dead between 2 and 4 in the morning, he'd let me rest my head on the folded winter coat I kept in my bag. Not sleep deeply, just close my eyes. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't stable, but it kept me off the street. I kept eating instant oatmeal, clearance bread, peanut butter packets taken from the hotel's continental breakfast when trays were being rotated out anyway. I drank the free lobby coffee because it was there and because hunger is easier to ignore when you're wired. But something shifted in me around that time. I bought a cheap spiral notebook from a discount store. The cover was neon blue. I started writing down every single expense. Gas, $18.47. Gym membership draft, $10. Oatmeal box, $2.99. I didn't round numbers. I didn't estimate. If I spent $1, it went in. At first, it felt obsessive, petty, like I was trying to control pennies because I couldn't control anything bigger. Then it started to feel stabilizing. When you're sleeping in your car, time becomes slippery. Days blend. Money disappears faster than you can mentally track it. The notebook forced reality to stay concrete. If I had $312 to my name, I knew exactly where it was going and how long it needed to last. I made tiny rules. No drive-through food. No impulse purchases, not even a bottle of soda. If I found bread discounted by 50% because it expired the next day, that was dinner and breakfast handled. If I used a gallon of gas, I calculated how many more job interviews or shifts that allowed me. The fear didn't vanish. It just changed shape. It stopped being this huge, crushing wave and became something more technical. Me versus numbers, me versus time. There were nights at the front desk when I'd watch exhausted families check in, kids half asleep on their shoulders, and I'd feel this strange tightness in my throat. Not jealousy exactly, just awareness. They had somewhere to go after that night. I had a car. But instead of spiraling, I'd open the notebook during a quiet stretch and run the math again. If I worked 5 nights a week, if I didn't miss a shift, if I kept spending under a certain threshold, how long until I could afford a deposit somewhere? How long until I wasn't calculating survival in gallons of gas? That was the first real shift. I stopped thinking of myself as abandoned and started thinking of myself as temporary. This situation was temporary. The car was temporary. The oatmeal was temporary. I didn't know how long it would last, but I decided it would not be permanent. And once I made that decision, I moved differently. The shift from surviving to building didn't happen all at once. It started with a regular guest. He stayed at the hotel a few nights every month. Quiet, always polite. He worked in medical administration, oversaw compliance and records for a private practice, from what I gathered in small pieces during late check-ins. I never overshared my situation. I kept it professional, but I asked questions: how systems worked, how patient records were handled, what audits looked like. I didn't ask for favors, I asked how things functioned. One night, during a slow stretch, he mentioned they were drowning in paper files. Years of patient records that needed to be scanned and organized for compliance reasons. He said it casually, like a complaint about traffic. I told him I was organized, that I learned fast. A week later, he offered me a temporary contract. It wasn't glamorous. I sat in a back office at the practice scanning, labeling, indexing files into digital folders. It was repetitive, detailed work, but it paid nearly triple what the hotel did per hour. Triple. I remember doing the math twice in the parking lot before my first day just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the number. The first paycheck felt unreal, not because it was massive, but because it created space. I could pay for gas without calculating which bill to delay. I could start saving for a security deposit without panic humming in my ears. I kept the hotel job for a while, stacking hours. Daytime contract work, overnight desk shifts, sleep in fragments, eat in the car, track every dollar in the notebook. But something else was happening while I scanned those records. I started noticing inefficiencies, duplicate processes, paper systems that could be simplified. I asked careful questions, not critical, just curious. The guest, my contact, noticed. When that short contract ended, another one followed. Different clinic. Similar problem. Organize, standardize, document processes. I didn't have formal credentials in operations. I had survival. And survival makes you pay attention to systems very quickly. By 23, I wasn't just scanning files. I was freelancing in operations support and compliance documentation full-time. I registered for online webinars during hotel breaks, watched free training videos about bookkeeping, workflow design, regulatory basics. I taught myself vocabulary so I could speak in rooms without sounding like I was guessing. At 26, I registered my own operations strategy firm. The name looked strange printed on official paperwork, like it belonged to someone older, someone more stable. I half expected someone to question me. No one did. By 31, I had 6 retained clients, 4 remote contractors working under me, a small downtown office with actual glass walls and a lease in my name. I remember standing in that empty office before the furniture arrived, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet. The numbers kept climbing. Retainers, contracts, investments. I hired an accountant. I bought a condo outright. No mortgage, no debt, comprehensive health insurance. Things that once felt like distant adult concepts became line items I could check off. The day my accountant told me my net worth had crossed into the low 7 figures, I didn't react the way people imagine you would. There was no gasp, no tears. I just stared at the spreadsheet on his screen and waited for my body to catch up. It didn't. I drove back to my condo that evening, parked in my designated space, and sat in the car for a few minutes. The same kind of silence as those supermarket nights, but different. No fear pressing against my ribs, just absence. I had spent so many years in motion, calculating, building, tightening systems, that when I finally reached stability, I didn't know how to feel it. Success didn't feel loud. It felt controlled. And I stayed that way. I never expected my past to catch up with me through a podcast. It started as a quiet feature on financial independence and estrangement, a chance to tell my story without framing it as revenge or drama. I recorded it calmly, as if recounting events to a friend, letting the details of survival, of being left behind at 18, speak for themselves. I didn't anticipate how quickly people would respond. Within days, the episode went viral. Comments poured in, messages from strangers who had experienced something similar, and then my inbox pinged with something that made my chest tighten, an email from my mother. Subject line, "We've always loved you." I froze. For a moment, part of me wanted to hit delete and let it vanish. But another part, still wired from decades of hypervigilance, wanted to see exactly what she would say after all this time. The email was carefully worded, full of vague affection and phrases like "proud of your accomplishments" and "hope you understand we did what we thought best." It made my stomach twist. That same familiar mix of irritation, disbelief, and guarded curiosity settled in. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my younger brother, Daniel. He messaged separately. He missed me. He wanted to fix things. His tone was hesitant, careful, like he wasn't sure if I would respond at all. I stared at the screen and felt that old instinct flare up. Timing is always telling. Always. I asked him casually, what changed? His reply landed almost immediately. He said he'd listened to the podcast and realized how badly things had sounded from his side. He was 16 back then, powerless, caught in the chaos of our parents' decisions. And then he mentioned it, the collapse of the family construction business, the strain of bills, and the fact that his wife was expecting their second child. My chest tightened again. That subtle context, the timing of outreach, the mention of financial strain, screamed motive. I could sense it without needing him to say it outright. My parents weren't reaching out because they finally recognized the harm they'd done. They were reaching out because the infrastructure keeping them afloat had faltered. I didn't respond immediately. I needed to sit with it. My brain traced every interaction back to patterns I'd seen growing up, small betrayals, excuses, half-truths, strategic silences. The instinct that had kept me alive for years in hotel lobbies, scanning files, and sleeping in cars flickered back. Measure everything before engaging. Still, part of me ached. Daniel wasn't my parents. He was my brother, the one family member I could theoretically reclaim without strings if the context allowed. I opened the message again, scrolling slowly, noticing the care in his words, the hint of exhaustion, the undercurrent of responsibility pressing on him. And I understood immediately that anything I said or did next would set the tone for what came after, whether reconciliation, boundaries, or confrontation. I sat in my office chair staring at the blinking cursor of my reply box. The silence around me was deafening. I realized, in that precise moment, that the next move wasn't just about old wounds resurfacing. It was about reading the room, about seeing the hidden leverage in timing, and acknowledging that, even after 14 years, some instincts never left me. I could feel my pulse, steady but wary. This was more than a simple reconnection. This was the first tangible sign that my story and my survival was about to intersect with theirs in a way I hadn't anticipated. We agreed to meet at a busy botanical garden, a neutral place, public, alive with families and tourists, far from the shadow of my office or the echo of our parents' mistakes. I arrived early, walking slowly along the winding paths, trying to feel normal while my mind ran through every possible scenario. Daniel showed up 10 minutes later. He looked smaller somehow, not in height, but in presence, physically exhausted, the lines under his eyes sharper than I remembered. His shoulders slumped, his hands in his jacket pockets, like he was carrying both the weight of the day and the weight of years I had no part in. He greeted me awkwardly, a stiff nod and a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. I noticed the pause before he spoke, like he was calculating what to reveal and what to hold back. He pulled out his phone and, after a brief hesitation, showed me photos of his daughters. 2 little girls, laughing in sun-drenched gardens, messy hair, tiny hands clutching toys. He didn't say much, just let the images speak. And yet, I could feel the subtle positioning underneath. The unspoken reminder that he had responsibilities I had not carried, that he was stretched thin. I said nothing, nodding slowly, studying the photos while my own emotions tried to settle into order. I could feel my pulse quicken. Part of me wanted to recoil, to retreat into the careful armor I had built over the last 14 years. But I stayed. I wanted to see him fully, to measure the reality behind the words and the images. He started talking about stress, about bills, about juggling the household, and then, hesitantly, about our parents. Even in apology or explanation, he kept circling the financial angle, the subtle suggestion that support might be expected. I noticed it instantly. A whisper of old patterns, the pressure I had spent years unlearning. I remembered Dr. Patel's voice from our last session. Even in apology, people sometimes unconsciously try to pull you back into the old hierarchy. Watch for the subtle positioning, it tells you more than the words themselves. I kept that in mind as Daniel leaned back on the garden bench. I could hear the slight tremor in his voice when he admitted how overwhelmed he felt. I noticed how he avoided saying anything about financial help directly, instead framing it as context. I could sense his sincerity mixed with caution, the same mix I had learned to read so well in our parents over the years. I asked questions carefully, my voice steady, not accusatory, but probing. I needed to understand the reality without giving ground. Each answer revealed more about the pressures he carried, about the lies our parents had told him to manipulate him over the years. And still, even as he spoke, I felt a mix of sympathy and wariness, careful to acknowledge his struggle without capitulating or letting it pull me back into patterns that weren't mine to own. By the time the meeting ended, I realized I had walked the line between empathy and boundaries. I had seen Daniel fully, the exhaustion, the responsibility, the love for his children, but I hadn't given him access to the leverage our parents still hoped to exert. I left the garden with a slow, measured calm, knowing that connection didn't require surrender. The escalation came faster than I expected. First, my mother called. Her voice was calm, too calm, but I could hear the familiar undertone of self-justification I'd grown up with. She framed the years of abandonment not as neglect or cruelty, but as proof that she had believed in my independence. Every word was measured, almost rehearsed, but the implication was clear. I was supposed to feel grateful for being left behind. My hands tightened around the phone, a faint tremor betraying the controlled composure I tried to maintain. The next day, an email arrived from my father. It wasn't an apology. It was a detailed outline of their current financial hardships and a request that I help stabilize them. I stared at the screen in disbelief, feeling the familiar rush of panic from old patterns, the same leverage I had learned to anticipate, now being wielded again. I drafted my response carefully. I laid out strict conditions: no loans, no shared finances, no contact unless they formally acknowledged what they had done, no vague promises, no implicit obligations. I hit send and sat back, bracing myself for the fallout. Almost immediately, Daniel responded. His message was measured but disappointed. "Sabrina, family should step up. You can't just cut them off like this." I read it twice, the words stinging, not because of disagreement, but because I could see the old cycle in microcosm. Even those who meant well could be subtly coerced into complicity. I typed back calmly, outlining my reasons, and then stopped engaging. I wasn't arguing anymore, I was setting boundaries. By the end of the week, things began to escalate in real life. My parents called my office line repeatedly, leaving long, angry voicemails accusing me of lying publicly. Emails arrived, lengthy and threatening, saying they would correct the narrative about me if I didn't respond. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of frustration and irritation I hadn't experienced in years. It was familiar and unwelcome, the sensation of being cornered by people who had once defined my world. One afternoon, my father and mother appeared at my office. They weren't subtle. They demanded to see me, waving their phones and papers, insisting that I hear them out. My heart rate spiked, and I refused to meet them at the desk. Security was called, and I watched from my office window as they were escorted out. The sense of disorientation, seeing authority remove them while I stayed calm, was oddly satisfying, though tinged with exhaustion. Then came the next twist. My father left a voicemail claiming he had a terminal illness, an urgent plea woven with guilt and desperation. I immediately contacted local authorities to verify. There was nothing, no medical records, no hospital contact. It was a fabrication. I could almost hear my younger self's disbelief echoing in my head. The lies were so thinly veiled, so characteristic, and yet, in real time, it felt like they might work. I sat at my desk, headphones in, replaying the messages, sorting through emails, cross-referencing times and details. The pattern was clear now. Every escalation was a calculated attempt to unsettle me, to bend me back into the old dynamics I had spent years dismantling. But unlike before, this time I had tools, leverage, and clarity. For the first time in years, I could recognize their tactics before they even landed fully. And I could prepare to respond, not with fear, not with capitulation, but with precision. A few days after the office incidents, Marissa, Daniel's wife, asked to see me in person. She arrived at my building carrying their youngest daughter, a bright-eyed toddler clutching a stuffed animal, and I could immediately sense the purpose behind her visit. There was no hesitation in her posture, no small talk, just intent. She wanted clarity, accountability, and to protect her family from the same patterns that had threatened mine. Once we were seated in a quiet corner of my office, she laid it all out. Months of lies my parents had fed Daniel and his family surfaced, claims that I had stolen money, that I was unstable, that I had abandoned them willingly. She showed me screenshots from social media posts and private messages where these falsehoods had been repeated, often to manipulate Daniel into compliance with their demands. Every word made my stomach knot. This was a version of me I hadn't known existed in their telling. Then came the financial details. Marissa had been quietly managing household finances while also contending with their parents' persistent drain. She revealed that my father was still listed on one of Daniel's bank accounts and, disturbingly, had spare keys to their home. My pulse jumped. These weren't just lies anymore, they were active breaches of trust, potential legal liabilities that could spiral quickly. Together, we went through the steps she had already taken. Locks had been changed, accounts closed, and independent counsel sought. Even so, escalation had already occurred. Daniel's car had been vandalized, tires slashed, and important documents had gone missing. Security footage confirmed our worst suspicions. My parents' vehicle had been near their house on the night of the theft. Each revelation tightened the knot in my chest. The stakes were no longer abstract. I made detailed notes while Marissa explained the police report she had filed, the emergency petitions for restraining orders, and the legal counsel she and Daniel had enlisted. I felt a strange mixture of relief and residual adrenaline, relief that someone had acted decisively, adrenaline at the sheer audacity of my parents, escalation. We cross-referenced emails, texts, and timestamps, creating a comprehensive picture of harassment that left no ambiguity. As Marissa spoke, I could sense her quiet anger turning to resolve. She had been protective of Daniel and their daughters for years, but now she was stepping fully into the role of shield against the manipulations my parents had tried to perpetuate. It was both grounding and sobering to witness. I realized that the fight was bigger than just personal closure. It was about preventing my parents from inflicting damage on others, even under the guise of family loyalty. By the end of the meeting, the plan was clear. We had documentation, verified patterns of harassment, and legal measures in place. The weight of confirmation settled in my chest, heavy but stabilizing. For the first time, the abstract threat had become tangible evidence, and I knew the next steps would need to be executed carefully, decisively, without letting old emotional instincts derail the strategy. The encounter with Marissa crystallized a reality I had anticipated but hadn't fully confronted. My parents' escalation wasn't just emotional, it was actionable, dangerous, and ongoing. And for the first time, I could meet it on equal footing, backed by law, strategy, and alliance. The day of the hearing felt surreal, like stepping into a world I'd only seen on television. I sat in the courtroom with my attorney, Rebecca Lawson, flanked by Daniel and Marissa. The air was thick with tension, the smell of polished wood and faint coffee pervading the space, but beneath it all was a tangible sense of legitimacy. This wasn't just another confrontation over emails and voicemails. It was formal, official, and undeniable. My parents entered last, taking their seats across from us. My mother's face was carefully composed, the kind of mask people wear when they're rehearsing deflection. My father looked impatient, shuffling papers, occasionally glancing at the clock, as if the world owed him patience. Neither met my gaze. Every instinct I had learned over 14 years whispered that this was going to be a test of composure, endurance, and documented truth. Rebecca began systematically presenting our evidence. Call logs, threatening emails, surveillance stills, bank account anomalies, screenshots of social media lies, everything meticulously organized. As each piece was displayed and entered into the record, I felt a gradual shift in my chest. The tight, familiar knot of fear loosening, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of control. Each click of a laptop, each page handed to the court clerk, reinforced that what they had tried to dismiss or minimize would now be formally acknowledged. When the judge asked my father about leaving me behind at 18, I could almost hear my younger self holding her breath. He minimized it, speaking in rehearsed tones about financial strain and independence, carefully sidestepping accountability. There was no anger, no genuine reflection, just the same narrative he had always used to excuse his absence. I felt a flicker of irritation, tempered quickly by the knowledge that the court didn't need him to acknowledge remorse. The evidence spoke for itself. By the time the judge granted 2-year restraining orders prohibiting them from contacting or approaching our homes and workplaces, the room shifted. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, my father's hand clenched around the edge of the table. But I didn't feel triumph in the moment. I felt something deeper and more stabilizing. The authority of the law formally recognized what had happened to me. My trauma, my history of being left behind, the relentless harassment. Someone in power had seen it, understood it, and acted. I leaned back slightly, a subtle exhale escaping me that I hadn't realized I was holding. Fear, so constant for so many years, had been replaced by legitimacy. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't vindication in a celebratory sense, it was validation. I was not lying, I was not imagining events, and I was no longer powerless. The papers on the desk, the gavel poised above, the clerk noting every order, they were physical manifestations of authority siding with truth. Walking out of the courtroom later, I noticed the weight in my shoulders had lifted, even if only fractionally. Daniel and Marissa gave me quiet smiles, and I realized that this was the first time an external system had acknowledged the reality I had been living, and that acknowledgement itself carried an irreversible shift. For the first time, I didn't just feel safer. I felt seen, official, and fortified against the chaos my parents had tried to perpetuate for years. The days leading up to the cafe meeting were tense in a way that gnawed at the edges of my focus. Even after the court hearing, harassment didn't stop. Anonymous packages appeared at my office, small boxes with no return address, sometimes just a note folded over with a single sentence. Think again. Then came the email, timed the night before my planned meeting with my parents. You will regret humiliating us." My pulse jumped the first time I read it, then steadied as I read it again. I had anticipated this. I had prepared. So I arranged the meeting. I chose a busy cafe near my office, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups providing both cover and a subtle reassurance that I wasn't alone. When they arrived, my parents carried the same mixture of entitlement and careful composure I'd seen in the courtroom, but now it was tinged with desperation. My mother's eyes were rimmed with tears she clearly hoped would soften me. My father's jaw was tight, hands clenched, like he was bracing for confrontation. I motioned for them to sit across from me, keeping my own posture straight, voice steady, and expression deliberately neutral. I laid out the documentation I had meticulously compiled over months, printed copies of emails, screenshots, call logs, surveillance stills, and records of all interactions that had led to police involvement and the restraining orders. Each piece was presented calmly, deliberately. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't lean in aggressively. I simply placed the truth in front of them, tangible and undeniable. Then I spoke clearly, letting the weight of the consequences settle between us. If either of you contacts me, Daniel, or Marissa again, these documents will be shared with extended relatives, former business partners, and anyone else you've tried to influence. This cycle ends here. My words hung in the air, measured, precise. I could see the initial flicker of disbelief cross their faces, followed by the first signs of panic, as if they realized that this time, I wasn't bluffing. My father's first reaction was outrage. "You're ungrateful?" he spat, leaning forward, fingers curling around the edge of the table. My mother sobbed softly, tears rolling down her cheeks, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We just wanted our family back." Neither of them attempted subtlety beyond this point, their familiar entitlement and defense mechanisms unraveling under the clarity of documented truth. I didn't engage in argument, didn't justify, didn't explain beyond what was necessary. I let their reactions exist, witnessed them, and held my ground. There was no shouting, no begging, no pleading, just a calm, unwavering assertion of boundaries. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I stood, collected my papers, and walked away. My steps were steady, unhurried, and I didn't glance back. For the first time, leaving didn't feel like retreat. It felt like reclaiming space, reclaiming power, reclaiming peace. The weight of fear that had accompanied every interaction, every threatened email, every subtle intimidation, vanished. I wasn't naive about the future. I knew the harassment could continue in minor forms, but in that moment, with the evidence laid bare and the cafe buzzing around me, I felt a clarity I'd never had before. This confrontation was over on my terms. The cycle was broken, and I was free to walk forward without fear. Weeks after the cafe confrontation, a plain white envelope arrived in my office mailbox. My mother's handwriting, familiar yet tentative, sprawled across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no flourish, no dramatics, just words that carried the weight of decades in their simplicity. She acknowledged the abandonment, admitted to seeking counseling, and wrote that she understood why Daniel and I had enforced strict boundaries. There were no requests for money, no appeals for reconnection beyond the slow, conditional access we had chosen to permit. The tone was sober, measured, and for the first time, fully honest. I read it once, then again, feeling the strange relief of a story finally told from the other side, yet stripped of manipulation. Daniel and I sat together, deciding to treat it as documentation, a confirmation of acknowledgement, not a carte blanche for trust. Access to our lives would be measured, conditional, and entirely on our terms. The envelope went into a locked drawer beside other records. Court orders, screenshots, logs, all tools of protection, not instruments of revenge. In the quiet that followed, I realized how much this letter represented, not a reconciliation, not forgiveness, but a permanent power shift. The pendulum had swung, finally and irrevocably. We had created a space where our boundaries could exist without constant erosion, where fear could be replaced with clarity, and where our lives would no longer bend to their attempts at control. I glanced at Daniel across the table, the weight of our shared history heavy, yet the air between us lighter than it had been in years. We didn't need to speak. The slow, deliberate boundaries we'd established were understood. Our parents' acknowledgement did not erase the past, but it cemented our authority over our present and future. The control we'd fought for, piece by piece, was now tangible, visible, and enforceable. As I placed the letter back in the drawer, I felt the subtle thrill of closure, not sentimental, not celebratory, just firm, composed, and unshakable. It was the final shift: accountability recognized, access regulated, power balanced. There would be no more unsolicited entries, no more threats, no more emotional manipulation. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe. Also check the description for another story that dives deep into resilience and reclaiming control.